I'd like to welcome everyone back to the MK Autos channel. Today we'll be installing these Godspeed lowering springs on this 2022 IS3U50 with the all-wheel drive model. So we are going to first take the front suspension apart, since that's going to be the easier part, and then we're going to work on the back. So going to the front, we're just going to take the wheels off first, we're going to jack up the car, and we're going to start on this right hand side. We're going to take our 17mm socket, and with our wheel lock, and we're going to loosen the wheels up first before we jack the car up. We're also going to go ahead and put some wheel chucks behind both rear wheels, just so that when we lift up the car in the front, the car doesn't roll back on us. So going to the side now, I have the jack mounted up onto the jack point, and we're going to start lifting the car up slowly, just to get that front wheel loose, so we can take the wheel off and start working on the front right suspension components. Alright, let's take that 10mm off. Okay, now with the brake line loose here, we can now work on taking the top 3 bolts as well as this bottom one. Now we're going to remove that 22 bolt. We're going to take our impact. Alright, with that bolt loose, now let's work on those top 3 bolts in the engine bay. Okay, now we're going to take our 14mm socket and we're going to loosen up these 3 bolts right here. Now with those 3 bolts removed, we can now take the shock and we can lower it. Okay, now with that loose, we can take out our tie rod, or just loosen that up so we can take the shock and move it out this way. Alright, now we're going to take our 17mm socket and we're going to take this tie rod bolt off. Okay, now with the tie rod disconnected, you can see we can just rotate the hub, and now we're going to have easy access to move this away and just pop this shock off. We just got to keep in mind to make sure that we don't tension this brake line too much, and so that it stays here and we don't bend it. We can also take this bolt up here, this 10mm, and remove it just so we have more slack with the brake line. Okay, now with that loose, you can see we have a lot more room. Now we're just going to take our mallet and we're going to hit the back side of this shock out. Before popping out this bottom bolt, we're just going to make sure we have one bolt still on top of the shock, just so when we pop this bottom piece out, the shock doesn't fall down on us. But once we have that bolt removed, we can just take the shock now, and we're going to take the tie rod, move it to the side, make sure this brake line is out of the way. And we're going to have the front shock taken out of the car, just like that. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take our compression tool that we got from the auto parts store. We're going to compress the springs, and we're going to be putting on the coilovers and the lowering springs. Now we're going to take our impact and we're going to tighten both of these spring compressors just enough so that we have some play between the spring and the shock component. And then once we have a little bit of slop between here, we can take this top bolt off. But first we're just going to tighten these. I'm going to do this off camera, but we're just going to tighten them enough, and then we're going to take this top one off. With this protective cap taking off this top hat, we're just going to take our 17mm socket, put it on here, and we're going to make sure that the shock is laying down and away from us, just in case this top piece does come flying off, it does not hit us. So I just took my pry bar and I just pried the spring off this top hat. As you can see, this part comes off, and then we can take the spring off, and then we just have the shock, and then we have this top hat. And now what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking our Godspeed lowering springs. We're going to compress these down just enough so that we can fit them in here. And we're just going to take everything and just put it in the reverse order back. We're going to take this, compress it, put it in here. We're going to compress this top hat, and then we're going to be ready to put this part back into the car. Once we have the shock put on just here, I'm just trying to line everything up so I know where to put these compressing tools. So this looks about right. We're going to take this top shock piece back off, and we're just going to take the coil back out from this top hat. We're going to move this all to the side. And now with these being aligned, we can now just tighten these down enough so that we can try test fitting it. So let me just tighten both these sides down, and then we'll do the next part. Okay, now with the spring compressed, you can see that there are 2 notches on both sides of this bolt. We're going to have to line up the top hat to fit on here. If you don't have it lined up, then the bottom parts will not be lined up as well to hold the spring on. But once we have that done, we're just going to take our bolt, we're going to put it back on here, and we're going to tighten it down with our impact or with our torque bar. And once we have that torque down, we're going to take these 2 spring compressors off, and we'll be ready to put this shock and lowering spring inside the car. Now with the shock put back together, you can see the lowering spring is put on. We have the top hat tightened. We haven't had this torque down yet because we want to put this top 3 bolts on first. Then we'll have access to tighten down this top bolt to 70 Newton meters. But we want to have this all set in just so that we don't have any twisting. So let's put this shock in through underneath this brake line, and then I'll have someone help me put one of the bolts up on top just so we have the shock held up on top. So what we did is we put the shock in underneath this line. We just put 2 bolts up top from the front side. Had someone put all their weight onto this front rotor. What you can do is you can also disconnect this upper control arm, but that's going to require more work. But as long as you get some weight here, you can force this bolt into the housing, and you just hit it with the hammer, and that's going to be fully seated. And now we can just tighten this bottom bolt that controls the lower part of the shock. We can just tighten this tie rod, and then we'll do the 2 10mm bolts along with torquing down the top hat, along with the center bolt that holds the whole shock together. So with the tie rod right here, we're just going to connect it to this front hub. We're going to tighten the back of this. We're going to also connect the 2 10mm bolts along with connecting the top hat and the 3 bolts that connect the shock to the top of the car. Once I have that done, I'll bring you guys back. Alright, now with these 3 bolts down to 70 Newton meters, we can put the wheel back on. Alright, now on the driver's side, I already went ahead and put everything together. You can see it's the same way as doing the right hand side one, just opposite. So we're just going to take the bottom bolt out right there. We're going to take the we're going to take this tie rod bolt out. We're going to take those 2 10mm bolts out, and then we're going to take the 3 bolts that are connected to the top of the shock, and then that shock should just come out same way as the other side. Now what we're going to do is work on the back side of the car. Now with both sides for the front lowered, we're going to work on the back. For the back part of the car, I have the car under tension. I jacked it up a little bit just so that the wheel is a little bit off the ground. I'm going to take these lug nuts, I'm going to loosen them, and then once I have them loose, I'm going to jack up the car all the way, and then we're going to take all these lug nuts off. Okay, now with that wheel loosened, we're going to jack the car up all the way. Control arm right here. We're going to take that bolt off. Then we're going to work on taking the sway bar link from the bottom out, which is going to be through this bolt on the bottom right here. Right, this one, right here. Then we're going to take the 2 bolts that hold this lower hub on. They're going to be on this side. As you can see, these 2 bolts. With those 2 bolts removed, this top one and then the sway bar removed, we can then lower this black lower control arm down, and then we can take the old spring out. So let me take these 2 bolts off, and let me take this top bolt off, the sway bar bolt off on the side, and we'll be right back. We're going to take our 19mm for this top bolt. And then we're going to take our 19mm as well on these other two bolts. With those loose, we're going to take one on each side to loosen up the nuts, or you can just do it hand tight. There's one nut. For the other nut, we're going to use a 19mm socket or wrench to hold it while we use our impact to take the bolt out. Just like that, we have both nuts off. We have this top nut off, and now all we have to work on is the sway bar linkage on the back side. Let me take that bolt off and I'll show you where we're at. The lower nut for the sway bar linkage, what I did is I took a 9/16 socket, and then I had one of these hexagonal bits. I put it into the middle of the hole, and then I had a wrench or a ratchet that I had, and I used a 17mm side to just loosen it up so that it wasn't spinning internally. Now that I have this nut off, we can now work on taking the sway bar linkage up. We're just going to take a jack and put it underneath this lower control arm just to give us enough tension to pull the bolt out. With enough pressure from the jack stand, as you can see, I got this lower part of the sway bar to disconnect. As you can see, that's going to let us drop the lower control arm more. Now we're just going to hammer out this control arm, put it to the side, and then we can lower this part more. As you can see, there we go. Now we have the sway bar disconnected as well up here. We have those two disconnected, and now we're just going to work on taking these bolts out all the way. With the shock bolt removed, now we can just work on the hub bolt on the bottom here. So what we had to do with this jack is we had to lift up this black side on this side for the lower control arm, just to give us enough tension to pull this bolt out. Once we have this bolt pulled out, we can slowly lower the lower control arm, and this should start to release all the suspension components. Okay, as you can see, that did lower the lower control arm, and it did lower the shock from its position. Now what we can do is we can put some pressure on this black lower control arm, pushing it down, and then we can pop this. Putting pressure on the lower control arm, this will just pop out like you saw. And now we're going to take our lowering spring, and we're going to put this top hat that connects the top part of the new spring, and then the bottom which connects the bottom one. Okay, so now what I did is I had someone help me push. They put their feet down on this lower part, and then what I had to do is I put the spring in inwards like this, make sure the top was seated first, and then when you have enough room on the bottom, it is easy to just put it in place. Now we have a lot of tension underneath on the bottom part, so now we're just going to have to put a jack stand underneath the lower control arm here, and then we can start putting the bolts back together. So as you can see, I jacked up the lower control arm, and now we have enough room to put this bolt into the shock. That's aligned, and now we take our bolt, put it on the other side, making sure that it's tight. Just hand tight for now until we tighten all the other components. With that in place, now we can work on taking the lower control arm and connecting it. So we're just going to jack up the car a little bit more. Okay, hitting the lower control arm from the other side will make sure that we line up with the hub. So as you can see from the top here, the linkage is right here, and then the link goes down to underneath. To underneath, it's going to be this bolt right here. We're going to take our nut and we're going to connect it to there. Once we have that connected, we can then work on taking this last hub bolt and mounting it. Okay, now with the jack jacked up all the way, you have to put this hub up a good amount just so that you have enough room to put this bolt in. As you can see, I fit the bolt in on both sides. This is for the shock and this is for the hub. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my socket and I'm going to tighten it on both sides. And then all we have left to do is to connect this control arm on this side underneath here and put a bolt on it. I'll take you guys in closer once I have both nuts put in. Okay, now with all those bolts put in, we have this control arm bolt put in, we have the hub bolt on the bottom, we have the shock bolt put in, we also have the sway bar link bar put in. We can now take our jack and slowly lower the rear assembly. There we go. Now once we have it lowered down all the way, all we have left now is to put on the wheel. So as you can see, we got everything put together. We have all the bolts back in the spots they need to be. Those are our new lowering springs put in. That's going to be it for the rear. Both sides of the rear are the same. You're just gonna have to have an extra jack just to play around with and to increase the level of the rear hub. Just because that shock and this bar are in a weird placement, it is going to be difficult to take that spring out. But with that extra jack and a little bit of leverage on the bottom lower control arm, it's going to be a pretty straightforward job. Let me put the wheel on and I'll show you guys the stance.